Hello, and welcome to I Am Not For Everyone, the podcast for those looking to release shame, heal from trauma, and feel really, really good being their fully expressed, authentic selves. My name's Dr. Lee, and I am a doctorally prepared nurse practitioner and a certified clinical trauma professional, as well as a mom, wife, and a human being navigating the world with complex PTSD. Season 1 of this podcast came about because I was tired of spending decades living in a shame-filled, trauma-laden body and brain. And after doing a lot of work and learning how to return to a safe, grounded place in my life, I knew it was time for me to take my experience in education and use my voice to unsilence myself, to release the leftover shame, and to give others permission to do the same. On Season 2 of this podcast, I'm going to be sharing my experience in education. But even more importantly, I'm going to be bringing on some incredible guests who are going to unsilence themselves. They're going to share their own stories of trauma, shame, and their journeys to healing, resiliency, and self-acceptance. While I believe these episodes will be deeply impactful, I do want to add a disclaimer that we're going to be talking about some potentially triggering topics. So please take the invitation to pause or skip or fast forward on any episode, and to treat yourself gracefully and kindly after each time that you listen. Let's dive in. Good morning. Hello, everybody. Happy Saturday. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm very excited to be talking about this topic today. So, today, we are going to be having a really, what I feel like is an incredibly important conversation, and one that is just not being had, I think, at the level or the depth of trauma-informed consideration that I think is necessary for us to really heal and understand one another and move forward. So this is a conversation that, like I said, it's a delicate, it feels like a delicate conversation. It feels like a conversation that, especially in today's social and political climate, is a scary one, a hard one to have. It's one that even talking about it myself can feel relatively uncomfortable. And I remind myself that when this happens, that I'm safe and I can regulate in my own nervous system and my own body and make sure that I am saying what I want to say. And I just want to name that. I want to name that having this conversation about intersectionality and marginalized identities and the trauma and the painful past learning that comes into how we understand who we are and how we understand who others are. I just want to name the discomfort and the vulnerability and the difficulty of this conversation. And we're going to talk about why it feels difficult. We're going to talk about why there are pieces and parts of this that feel sticky and feel heavy and feel hard. Because I think that is also an important thing to understand. And so if you're watching this replay or if you're on here with me live and you're listening and you start to have some feelings, if you're noticing some resistance in your body, if you are noticing yourself start to get into a posture of protection or fight mode, right? Like you're noticing any sort of sympathetic activation, like your heart's racing or your palms are sweating. If you're noticing your brain immediately saying, no, that's not true, or that can't be right. If you're noticing resistance like that, this is an invitation for you to notice that, to get curious about that, to pay attention to what's going on in your body as we talk about this. And the opposite might be true for you. Some of this might feel a little bit triggering. Some of this might feel a little bit it might invoke feelings of, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I was doing this, or wow, I didn't recognize this is how I was showing up, or I never knew other people were going through that. And so there might be some guilt, there might be some shame, there might be some self-blame coming up. And if that's happening, cool, great. Also a really helpful thing to notice in your body, a helpful thing to pay attention to, a helpful thing to guide you in understanding your nervous system better and what does bring on shame and what does bring on guilt and what does make you feel bad about yourself. Where are the patterns there? This is a great learning opportunity. So I want to just start with the definitions of marginalized identity and intersectionality. A marginalized identity or marginalized people are people who experience patterns of social and political inequality due to belonging to a group, having membership in a group that has been assigned negative characteristics, a negative place in our society or in the society. So, people who experience patterns of social and political inequality due to belonging to a group that has a negative association, negative characteristics in the eyes of society. Okay. So, when we talk about marginalized identities in here, y'all know that I am not big on assigning character or habits as character traits. And so when we talk about people who traditionally have a marginalized identity, we're talking about this as a whole. There are a lot of people, when I go through this list of marginalized identities, they are going to say, you know what? I don't feel that way. I don't feel that way. I don't identify as somebody who's marginalized. I don't identify as somebody who has had negative consequences from belonging to this group. And I think that this is a really important part of the conversation. And we're going to get into this a little bit more. But this is the difference between individual identification and group identification. And so just know that even using this term, someone who saying someone holds a marginalized identity, even if they are in a group that has been identified as a marginalized group, a single human may not identify with that label. They may not agree that they feel marginalized. And so just know that term doesn't resonate with some humans. That term doesn't resonate with some people who are in marginalized groups. And so being respectful of that, and being able to say, hey, I'm using this term from a generalized perspective, not from an individual perspective. I'm not telling you that there's negative associations for being you. I'm saying that in the general social and political climate, there is a consensus that belonging to this group has negative associations attached with it that cause social and political inequality. So some groups that are in the marginalized identity under that umbrella, LGBTQ+, trans, racial and cultural groups. And this changes. This is the other thing I meant to say before we even go into this. This changes at different times, in different places, in different cultures, in different political climates. Who is marginalized changes. So just because you are in a marginalized group here in America, you may not be in a marginalized group going over to another country. Or if we went back 200 years, you may not be a marginalized group there. So just know that this changes as the social and political climate changes, who is marginalized changes. So LGBTQ+, trans, racial and cultural groups, veterans, military personnel, people with lower intelligence, below average intelligence, lower IQs, people with cognitive impairments, people who are physically challenged or differently abled, people with serious persistent mental illness, people with substance abuse disorders or other forms of addiction, such as gambling or sex addiction, sex offenders, homeless or very low socioeconomic status, very poor humans, felons, people who have been convicted of a felony or who have done jail time, people who have criminal records, those who are neurodivergent. So ADHD, autism, sensory processing disorders, anyone who falls outside of the norm of how we think people are supposed to act from a neurological perspective, complex PTSD, people with serious persistent mental illnesses and neurodivergence. And also one that's not on this list, I got this list from the Minnesota Psychological Association, if anyone else wants to go look up this list. But something else that's not on this list is people with invisible disabilities, which a lot of these people fall into. But people with mental health issues, people with, I have something called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And so the things that my body is able to do compared to what other bodies are able to do it's different. And so what is interesting about that is that a lot of times especially when we were younger, before EDS was like a better known diagnosis, we were accused of malingering. We were accused of having, health issues or making things up, having psychosomatic health issues. Fibromyalgia is another big one of these, which is also very related to trauma, by the way. And so anyone who could be categorized into these identities from the social and political perspective, oftentimes there are negative associations tied to all of these groups. I'm sure if you just ran down this list, right? Think about how we talk about people who are homeless, right? Like we say the homeless. If you're talking to somebody who has a job, has children, is doing has a really good handle on everything and is homeless, oftentimes the way that we are going to identify them is as a homeless person, not as a person who is temporarily without a home, right? There's a difference between saying somebody is in our society, saying somebody is homeless and saying somebody is without a home. There's a difference between saying somebody is an addict or an alcoholic versus saying that somebody has a substance use disorder. There's a difference between calling somebody, and I want you to just hear these terms, because obviously I don't use these terms, but thinking about calling somebody crippled versus saying that they have a a difference in physical ability, right? Even disability can mean something, can feel not good for that marginalized identity, right? For that identity, a lot of people prefer differently abled. And I think that just having this conversation, right? The reason that we want to bring intersectionality into this is because so many people have. And by the way, what I also think is interesting is gender's not on here. And I think gender should absolutely be on here from a marginalized perspective, because there are some places in the social and political climate where gender very much causes marginalization. And just look at the C-suites of the top 1,000 Fortune companies in the United States or across the world. Look at the top companies and tell me how many people are women. Tell me how many people are non-binary. Tell me how many people are LGBTQ in those spaces that are openly out and willing and able to identify with that without fear of repercussion or discrimination. Let's have a conversation about that, right? So I think gender and sexuality, definitely both of those deserve to be in those groups. But when we talk about intersectionality means the meeting of my identities. The meeting of my identities. So for me, as a woman of color who is Black, white, and Indigenous, right? As a woman, as somebody who has an invisible disability, as someone who has a diagnosis that falls under the serious and persistent mental illness, which again, I don't even like that term, because mentally ill, think about how we talk about that. Mentally ill. Does it feel good to have an identity that is defined by illness, right? Even that has a hugely negative association tied to it, right? So thinking about this is huge. And the intersectionality, this is both, how do I want to say this? This is influenced by how our societies run. Our intersectionality, some of the very things that make us marginalized, that put us into marginalized groups, occur because we have one marginalized identity, and that from a societal perspective puts us at higher likelihood of getting another one. So let me give you an example. In the United States, around 1 in 3 Black males will end up in the prison system at some point, will end up with a criminal record. And when we compare that to white males, and I forget the statistic on white males, it's drastically lower. And when we think about the proportion of Black males in the United States to the proportion of white males, that number is drastically different as well. So when we look at people of lower socioeconomic status, when we look at people who have a racial identity, that then increases their likelihood of having another marginalized identity, aka a felon, aka homeless, substance use disorder, or persistent mental illnesses that oftentimes come along with incarceration and the inability to get a job, the inability to find work, the inability to have people trust us afterwards. And when we look at how society has set up and decided who it gets to identify or who becomes identified as a felon, who becomes identified as someone with a criminal record, how does that happen? When we look at the laws behind that, things start to get really interesting, right? When we look at laws between crack cocaine and cocaine, powdered cocaine, when we look at the laws that were put into effect of one is, okay, this means that you're going to get this charge. And the other, which is associated with more of the non-white community, you're going to get a felony for having this. All of a sudden, we start to see how society and how our laws and how who are making those laws, how they determine who becomes marginalized and who becomes to have a more complex intersectional identity. And so I think that the reason I'm talking about this is not from a social or political perspective. I don't want to get into that at all really here. My point is think about if you are somebody who has a marginalized identity that has negative associations tied to it, that's going to cause, in most cases, a lot of painful learning, a lot of traumatic experiences, a lot of experiences where when you are moving through life, you feel less safe than the person next to you. And some of this is organic. Some of this it's because this is the way it is, right? When we look at statistics like the ones I just shared with you, we can't argue with that. We can't say, oh, well, that's because of there's character flaws or things like that. No, that's because there are laws set up to create and put these people who are already marginalized into even further marginalized categories to create even more complex intersectionality for these people. And as somebody who holds multiple marginalized identities, you are getting messages from society that are true, that are actual, like you aren't psychologically safe here. You're interacting with people who say harmful things about your identity. You're experiencing situations in which harmful things are occurring. And the messaging that you are getting from society is also, especially like if you watch news media or social media, is you are not safe here. You are not safe here. As a woman of color, I can tell you over the last few years, I've had to stop watching the news because the news tells me that as a woman of color, now as a lighter woman of color, the news tells me that I'm safer than the people who also identify as people of color that are darker. That's what the news and that's what society tells me. But society says this part of your identity isn't safe. Because look at what happens when you go out into public. Look at what happens when you encounter police. Look at what happens when you do this. And so there is a fundamental distrust that can create in my nervous system. And so then when I go out into society, I may meet an individual that has a different identity than me, that has an identity that's non-marginalized, right? And when I go to interact with them on an individual level, this person may be very safe. They may see me as a human being and not as my identities. They may be willing to get to know the person inside me. They may be very trauma informed. And there is still going to be a little inkling, if not a big inkling, in my nervous system that's saying, can you trust this person? Because they are part of this other group. And that group has told you time and time again that you are not safe in this space. The people in here who identify as women, right? I want you to think about how we are taught, right? That our identity means that we are going to potentially be taken advantage of by men. How we have to always be on the lookout, hold our keys between our hands, right? Have our can of mace on us, always be looking out for someone who is going to hurt us. And we can be in relatively safe neighborhoods or in relatively safe spaces, but our nervous system is always on alert. because it's been taught to be on alert. And so sometimes what I want you all to hear, what I think is a very important point here, is that trauma, having the experience of past painful learning, you are not safe here, isn't always from a personal experience. Sometimes it's from a collective experience. It's from hearing about your brothers and sisters and elders and the other people in your group who have experienced very hard things. And when we get bathed in that, when we get soaked in that from an early age, nothing's happened to me, but all of these things have happened to my people. That is traumatic. That is collective trauma. That is generational trauma, ancestral trauma. I tell this story, as a lighter skinned person of color, I think I might have shared this in here. In my ancestral lineage, there was a choice that was made by an ancestor who was indigenous to identify as Black and to be sold into slavery instead of to be forced to go on the march of the Trail of Tears. The choice was genocide or slavery. And while that was several generations ago, that gets passed down from a DNA perspective and from a cultural perspective. So even as someone who fits in more with the non-marginalized identity, that feeling of unsafety is still there sometimes. That feeling of unsafety of even should I tell people that I hold this identity, right? And what I will tell you is that oftentimes, like there are several times that doesn't feel safe because I've heard what people say when they don't recognize that I hold that identity. I've heard the negative associations that they have put on the Black and brown people that have come up in conversation. And my nervous system goes, whoa, no, it is not safe to tell people that we are this. So the other thing that I think is that I alluded to at the beginning that I want to talk about here is the difference between individuality and collective, right? This comes up a lot when we have conversations around how collective trauma, ancestral trauma, and personal trauma can interact with one another. So oftentimes there are people in groups, in these marginalized groups who say, you know what, I don't have any personal experience of trauma here. I don't have a lot of generational experience of trauma here. And while I see that collectively the group that I belong to has a lot of past painful learning, my nervous system, I don't have experience with that. So I'm not going to identify with that trauma. I feel safe holding this identity. And this is where, from a social and political perspective, we can get people who end up on the other side. I'm making air quotations, the other side of where we expect them to fall from a sociological or economical or political perspective, because they're not identifying with their group in terms of this perspective. And the last election, I watched this happen a lot. I experienced this because the way that I saw things was different than how some people expected me to see things. And so there was a lot of shaming and a lot of, not just towards me, but towards a lot of people of, you're not identifying with the problems and the trauma and the past painful experiences that lead this group to have these thoughts and this platform or these ideas. And so we are going to shame you to try to get you back into the fold, to try to bring you back in alignment with our group, because that is what feels safe for us. You leaving and you not identifying in the same way that we identify feels unsafe. It feels like you are joining the other side. And this is where, in my personal opinion, most people get stuck. This is where the conversation ends. The conversation ends in shame. The conversation ends in, if you don't think like us, then you don't get to be a part of our group, right? I'm thinking of some of the sayings that I hear towards Black people who don't show up in the way that they are expected to, right? Uncle Tom, you're uninvited from the cookout, right? A lot of things that get said to make these individuals feel bad about how they are showing up. And the big thing here is that in like I said, in my opinion, it's time to transcend that conversation, because that conversation is not trauma informed. That conversation is not psychologically safe. That conversation is based in scarcity, and it's based, and if I am being perfectly transparent, it's based in a society that is bathed in scarcity, that is bathed in shame, where how we regulate our nervous systems is from a very actually dysregulated place. It's a fear-based system. And I talked about this, I want to say a few, like 1 or 2 lives ago, where shame was evolutionarily helpful. Before we developed prefrontal cortexes, before we developed our ability to think about our own thinking, shame was how we stayed alive. So when I talk about being anti-shame, I want to be very clear that I see how shame served a purpose for a very long time for us as humans. And in these recent thousands of years, where we have started to transcend, where our nervous system has changed, where we now have a polyvagal nervous system. Most animals have a vagus nerve that is just one long line, and it doesn't do different things. By the way, your vagal nerve is connected to your parasympathetic nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system is what initiates fight or flight. Most animals' vagal nerves, they just have what's called the dorsal vagal nerve. And that is what puts us into freeze. That is what puts us into faint or fade. That is what puts us into dissociation and stuckness. It's what makes us physically and mentally immobile. And we as humans have developed something really cool called our ventral vagal nervous system. And I'll talk more about this in another live. I'll do one all about polyvagal theory, or join the trauma certification if you want to go really in depth with that, because we're going to be talking about that a lot. So we as humans have a ventral vagal nervous system. And this is the part of our nervous system that embraces connection, that sees sameness, that is able to participate in empathy and co-regulation, and really help other humans feel safe. It helps us connect with one another. And the way that our society is currently functioning, and it's starting to change because there's people like me and there's lots of researchers and other humans out here doing this work. The reason why this gets to change is because when we can actually step out of the fear-based and the scarcity-based mentality and start to connect with one another from our ventral vagal nerve, where we can start to see, oh, wow, you know what? What's happened to you? What have you gone through in your life that is different from me? And even though we hold these same identities that society says we should have this same experience, I can recognize that we've had different experiences. So tell me, help me understand. Let me listen to you as you share with me why you believe what you believe. I read this really great quote. I can't remember what book it's in. It's going to drive me crazy, but even that statement right there, drive me crazy, right? Like, not something that I'm trying to catch myself whenever I use that word crazy, because again, it identifies with serious and persistent mental illness. That is do you see the negative associations? When we think something that's, or when we experience something that is out of the norm, we identify it from a mental perspective, we identify it as crazy, right? So still catching myself in that language all the time. So please do not beat yourself up if you're catching yourself as well. But the quote in this book, it was actually a story, and he was talking about this young man who was watching these two gentlemen argue back and forth across the table for about 2 hours. And they got up and they hugged. And the guy was like, I was going to intercede because that argument was like so long and neither of you won. And the old man that he was talking to turned to him and said, we weren't arguing to win. We were arguing to understand one another. And like, that almost brings me to tears, right? Can you imagine if we could sit down and have conversations where we get very passionate about our opinions and beliefs, and we are doing it in a way where we are willing to then, when we are done talking, listen to the other person, really hear what they have to say, not be listening to respond, but be listening to understand. Not be listening so that we can find a point to win an argument, but listen so that maybe our viewpoint can change. And I love this because this is how we do trauma-informed relationships. Is instead of when somebody presents in front of us that activates our nervous system, when somebody starts arguing with us, when somebody is causing our body to feel psychologically unsafe, not physically unsafe. If you're feeling physically unsafe, then please participate in whatever you need to in order to get out of that situation. Thank you. But from a psychological safety perspective, when we can recognize that we're going into our sympathetic activation, we're like, we want to fight or we want to flee, or when we can recognize that we're dropping into our dorsal vagal nervous system and we are freezing or we are fainting or we are dissociating, right? When we can do that, and then know how to pull ourselves back up, how to regulate how to have a conversation with somebody that pulls us back into our ventral vagal system and says, you know what you just said there, ooh, I'm feeling a lot of sensation in my body as I'm listening to you say this. Could you tell me more? I want to understand. What would it look like on the debate stage? What would it look like on the floor of Congress? What would it look like in a student or a parent and school board meeting? What would it look like on the news media? What would it look like in our everyday interactions with humans if that was how we were approaching things? And I think that this is just such an important conversation to have, especially tying it into marginalization and intersectionality, because the thing of it is this, is that as much as we want to pretend, as much as we strive for equality and even equity, that's not really what we want. And I'm going to say this, and this is going to be controversial. This is going to go against or be a twist on a lot of diversity and equity and inclusion programs out there. We're not going after equity. Equity doesn't create safety. And hear me out on this. Equality says that we all get the same thing. But that's a problem if there are people who have marginalized identities where even getting the same thing, where they don't get the same thing, right? Or even getting the same thing doesn't help them get to the same place as people who don't hold those identities, right? It's like saying there's stair access to the subway, so everybody should be able to get on it. We made it accessible, except it's not accessible to everyone. Everyone can't take the stairs. So then we went from equality to equity. Okay, so let's give everyone who's not at the same place a leg up. But the problem with that is that doesn't create safety in our nervous systems. As someone who has received legs up, what that does is that still reminds me that I am marginalized. That still creates past painful learning. I've told this story before. But I'm going to tell it again because I think it fits really well here. When I was in high school, we all had to take the pre-SAT, the PSAT. our junior year. And I remember a couple weeks after taking the PSAT, getting called into a room, and it was a big, like a boardroom, right? Or like the meeting room at the high school where typically the adults sat, right? And there are 10 green papers and 1 yellow paper. And they sat me down in front of the yellow paper and sat the other 10 people down in front of the green papers. And what they said was, those of you who have the green paper, congratulations. Actually, they said this to everyone. Congratulations, everyone. You scored at a level on the PSAT where you get a scholarship to college, where you are national merit. I can't remember what they're called, but national merit finalists or something like that. And I remember looking around the room, and then I remember looking at my paper and I was like, okay, but why is my paper a different color? And they said, oh, well, you didn't score high enough to get the national merit score. It was like 212. You scored a 210. But that's high enough for the National Achievement Scholarship, AKA the Person of Color Scholarship. And I remember sitting there thinking, okay, so I am less than. And as a person of color, you are deciding to give me a leg up. So I get to go to college for free, but did I actually even earn this? Or are you just is this just a nice way of helping out a person of color? Do I belong at the table with these people? I didn't score the same score. When I go to college, am I going to be smart enough to fit in with these people? Because if 212 gets you the full scholarship and I scored 210, what does that mean? And I didn't want to take it. I was like, I don't feel like I've earned this. This doesn't feel good. And that is an example of equity. And it's an example of, we're going to give you a leg up because you hold this marginalized identity. And that's not going to feel good. And yes, did I take that opportunity? Absolutely. I ended up having a conversation with my father and my grandfather and said, I really don't want to do this. And then the interesting thing about that conversation was, no, you should take the full scholarship for all of us, because think about everything that the generations before you have gone through so that you can have this opportunity. And so there was a lot of then pressure from that perspective. Think of all the past painful learning. Think of all the trauma that your family has been through. So you need to take this opportunity and you're going to represent all of us. This is for all of us. That's a lot of pressure. And it's not pressure that I am so incredibly grateful and thankful for the ability to go to a school, the ability to have that. And what I want everyone to hear is that that's still not trauma informed, especially if you think of how that conversation occurred. Maybe 2 separate rooms would have been good. Maybe similar color papers would have been good. How in the fight for equity are we still creating division? Are we still making people feel other than, less than? So what we are going after with trauma-informed practices in the diversity and in the inclusion and in the marginalized identity and in intersectionality in this space is we're going after justice. And what justice means is that everyone is not treated equally, but they are treated fairly. We look at their situation. We look at the context. We look at what happened. We look at their past painful learning. We give their life and the meaning of their life and the experiences of their life weight. We listen. We pay attention. We understand. And when we can do that, when we can take something that we've been just putting collective fixes on and actually create a collective fix that is individualized, this is where the real magic occurs, right? And here's the thing, though. Justice is not prescriptive. Justice is not prescriptive. I can't write a prescription for justice. I can't say, okay, you have this situation, I'm going to do this. You have like X is happening, so it's X. Y is happening, so it's Y. Z is happening, so it's Z. It requires discernment. It requires us to understand. It requires us to listen. It requires us to really weigh things. And in a society like ours, the way that it is set up, in a very toxic productivity syndrome way, in a very, we need to produce as much as possible, we need to do things as quickly as possible, sometimes this gets lost. We want to put the easier solution, the blanket solution on things, right? We want to just install the wheelchair ramp and just say, okay, that's enough, right? Instead of thinking like, okay, but does it make sense to even have the subway underground? Does it make sense to have the subway underground? Does it make more sense to bring the subway above ground so that everyone can get to it? And also, are we paying attention to where the subway goes? Are we paying attention to the fact that the subway's not going out to these neighborhoods that really need a subway? Are we paying attention to the fact that the way that we have the seats on this don't work for everyone? Are we paying attention to the fact that the way that we make announcements on the subway can really bother or disturb people with neurodivergence? Are we paying attention to the fact that a blanket solution doesn't always work and doesn't usually work? Are we actually thinking about this at the individual level? Are we getting feedback from the very people we are trying to help? And in fact, are we pulling them into the room for the conversation? And by the way, anyone who's a manager, anyone who does HR in here, this conversation is really for you, because I get the desire to have a one size fits all. This is equality. And I get the desire to look at people's intersectionality and go, okay, so since you're a woman and since you're a person of color and since you're this is what you get. I get the desire to be prescriptive. And I want to encourage you. I want to invite you to think about this in a different way and instead say, how can I individually help every human who walks into this space? As a teacher, how can I individually get to know and understand each one of my students and give them what they need? How can I find the barriers that have been constructed that if I take those down, everyone has an easier time? That's justice. And justice is hard because justice requires looking and finding those barriers that oftentimes work for the people who aren't marginalized. Justice is hard when you are in a non-marginalized position because it often looks like you're going to lose something by giving everyone else a fair chance. And what I want to say here is that is scarcity mentality. What I will tell you as someone who runs a business based in justice, who runs a business based in trauma-informed practices and creating psychological safety, is that sometimes you put up more money up front. Sometimes you put up more time, money, and energy up front. And the return on investment on that, on having people who join your organization, who join your team, who decide to learn with you, to work with you, to create with you. When you do that, when you invest that time and money and energy up front, while the goal isn't for it to pay dividends all the time, like, return on investment is a goal. It's not the primary goal for us, but it's a goal. And when we don't talk about that, when we just pretend that we're doing diversity and inclusion work because I really care about you and I care about your past and I care about your identity, when in reality, this is all about money. And it's about picking the easiest solution for me as the CEO versus actually doing what's good for the people that work for me or with me. That's a problem. So this is also why I preach mutually beneficial relationships. Y'all know when you enter into a business relationship with me that one of the reasons this is happening is so I can make money. And the other reason we're entering into this relationship is so that you can get what you need, is so that you can get your needs met. both of our needs get met in this relationship. And there's not a hierarchical feeling to that relationship. And I know, like we've talked about, this has been preached out in corporate settings and in political settings, treating the CEO like the janitor. Well, do we actually treat the CEO like the janitor? Do they get paid the same? Do they have the same work hours? Do they have the same responsibilities? How about we stop trying to treat everybody the same and we start trying to treat everybody as who they are? That is the goal of a business that is based in justice. That is the goal of a business that is based in mutually beneficial relationships. That is the goal of a truly trauma-informed organization and corporation or business. So when we think about intersectionality and marginalization and trauma, just remembering that just because the person that is in front of you, you can't see anything, that you can't see their trauma. Just because the person in front of you has a marginalized identity doesn't mean that they have personal trauma. And understanding that, getting to know each and every individual in a personal way is how you are going to be able to create justice for everyone in your circle, everyone in your business, everyone in your organization, everyone on your team. Understanding that and being able to take that perspective of where are the barriers that make this harder for some people? Where are the things that we're not considering? What are the questions we're not asking? Who are the people we're not talking to? What are we missing? How are we creating a psychologically unsafe environment? Asking that question is going to have one of the biggest returns on investment that you can imagine. Because your people are going to they're going to learn that you are safe. And the return on investment in that is priceless, but also very quantifiable, both qualitatively and quantitatively. So thank you all so much for joining me on this Saturday. We will be back to our normal Thursday time next week. If this is something you are interested in learning more about, we're going to be having this conversation much more in depth in our upcoming trauma-informed psychologically safe certification, our TRIP certification that is launching in just a few, I'm looking at the date. I didn't even remember what date it was, in like a little over a week. If you'd like to get on the wait list for that, please let me know. If you are in an organization or a corporation or a business and you want to learn how to incorporate trauma-informed practices, psychologically safe practices, just practices into your hiring, into your management of people, into your standards of practice, into your business as a whole, so that you can create a place that people really love to stay, please let me know. This applies if you have one employee. This implies if you have hundreds of employees, or if you work for an organization that you really think this would be beneficial for, please connect us, because this is the work that we're going to be doing at the Institute. And if you desire to be doing this work with us, we still have a few very select spots left in our teacher training certification. That begins in January. And that is where you learn all of the things that I'm teaching you now. And then you learn how to go into the places of your choice, of your desire, the places that your heart is called to, and teach these things. So, and help others apply them in a way that really helps spread this message, that helps us create a society that is more just, that is more trauma-informed, that is psychologically and physically safer for people who hold all identities. So if you're interested in that, you can drop something in the comments or send me a DM. Happy to give you more information on the trauma-informed certification and or the teacher training, whichever calls your fancy. And I will see you all on Thursday. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy day to listen to our episode. If it resonated with you, we'd absolutely love it if you'd give us a rating in the App Store, or if you'd share the episode with a friend or two. And if you're looking for even more resources, community, and education around what it means to be trauma-informed and to live a psychologically safe life, we would absolutely love to have you join us in our free Facebook community, Becoming Trauma-Informed. You can find the information in the show notes, and we're so excited to welcome you into our community.